He froze in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The steam still clung to his skin, drifting around him in thin, trembling ribbons. And across the room, Claire stood perfectly still, breath caught, eyes wide, realizing she had stepped straight into a stranger's private grief without meaning to. Outside, the executive floor was silent, washed in the late morning light that made everything look more honest than it should. Inside that small sanctuary, the air felt warmer, heavier, carrying something she couldn't name yet, loss, maybe, or the echo of a life that had been broken long before she walked in. He was a man who looked like he should have had everything: power, money, control. Yet in that moment, he seemed unbearably human, as if one wrong word might undo him. And she was just trying to start over at 38, on a day when her hands were already shaking from too many responsibilities and not enough hope. Two people who weren't supposed to meet this way. Two wounds brushing against each other by accident. If you've ever opened a door you weren't ready for and found a different kind of truth waiting, this story may feel familiar. Let's begin. The moment Claire pushed the door open, a wave of warm steam rolled toward her like breath from another world. She felt it before she saw anything, the heavy, fragrant air brushing against her face, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus. For a single confused heartbeat, she thought she had wandered into a hotel spa by mistake. Then her eyes adjusted, and she realized she wasn't alone. A man stood a few feet away, half turned toward the sound of the door. A white towel rested low around his waist, water still tracing thin, shimmering lines down his chest. Claire didn't recognize him at first. She only caught the startled tension in the set of his shoulders, the way one hand gripped the marble counter as if he needed something solid to hold on to. But when he lifted his head and their gazes met, her breath caught. It was Daniel Hawthorne, the CEO, her boss, her first day. She froze, her hands still on the doorknob. She felt the heat rush to her cheeks, too sudden and too fierce to hide. The room around her glowed with soft amber light, reflecting off the stone walls in a way that made the whole space feel almost sacred, like a sanctuary she had no right to enter. Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thin and breathless. She stepped back, but her heel brushed against the threshold, and she fumbled for balance. Daniel didn't move at first. He looked at her with a stiffness that wasn't anger, not really. It was something quieter, deeper, something that pulsed through the silence between them. His jaw tightened slightly, and Claire saw the exact moment recognition settled into his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low, velvety, but edged with something fragile. "This floor is restricted access." "I know. I didn't know. I'm new. I was trying to find the nearest restroom, and the sign downstairs said..." She stopped when her own words tangled together. "I'm sorry. Truly." His eyes didn't leave hers, not even for a second. She wished he would look away. She wished the ground would swallow her. She wished the last 6 months of rebuilding her life hadn't led her to humiliate herself 5 minutes into her new job. He released a long, slow breath, and his fingers loosened on the counter. A subtle tremor passed through his hand, the kind of tremor that belonged more to a memory than a person. "And your name?" he asked. "Claire. Claire Dalton." The steam curled around him like a veil, softening the harshness of the moment. Claire tried to keep her gaze steady, tried not to notice the droplets of water that clung to his skin, the faint red marks on his knuckles as if he had gripped something too tightly before she entered. Daniel nodded once, but his eyes carried an unsettled weight. "And what exactly brought you through that door?" There it was, the question she dreaded, but something in his tone startled her. It wasn't a sharp demand, nor the clipped irritation she had expected from a man with his reputation. His words wavered ever so slightly, as though speaking them cost him something. "I was lost," she said. "It's my first day. I thought this was the hallway to the general offices." For a moment, he closed his eyes. Just a blink, but long enough for her to sense the shift. When he opened them again, they looked older, tired, like the world pressed on him too heavily, and he didn't have the strength to hide it. "That explains it," he murmured, though he didn't sound convinced by his own restraint. Claire stepped back, eager to retreat before she did more damage, but she hesitated when she saw his hand grip the counter again, tighter this time. His knuckles blanched, and something flickered across his expression, something she wasn't supposed to see. Pain. She didn't know why it hit her so sharply, why the sight of a powerful man holding himself together with such rigid control felt more intimate than the steam-filled room or his half-covered body. But it did. "I'll leave," she said softly. "I'm sorry to have interrupted." She didn't add what she truly felt. "I'm sorry to have walked into something that wasn't mine to witness." He nodded again, but the movement was small, almost mechanical. "Thank you, Ms. Dalton." She turned toward the hall, but before she stepped through the doorway, his voice followed her. "How did you even get the elevator to stop on this floor?" "I didn't," she said, glancing back. "Someone held the door for me at the last second." I assumed it was the right one. A faint crease formed between his brows. "I see." The words were barely more than breath, and they carried that same tremor, quiet, unsteady. She had no idea what she had stumbled into, no idea why a simple mistake seemed to pierce something raw inside him. But the weight of his gaze lingered long after she stepped out into the cooler hallway. As the door eased shut behind her, Claire pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the strange mix of humiliation and concern tugging at her. She didn't know which feeling unsettled her more, but as she walked away, one thought clung to her with unnerving clarity. Why had he looked wounded? Why had her presence, her mistake, her simple entrance opened something in him that he clearly didn't want anyone to see? 2 hours earlier, Claire sat behind the wheel of her aging silver sedan, hands wrapped around the steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. The engine hummed softly under her palms, but she barely heard it. All she heard was her own breathing, too shallow, too quick. She whispered to herself, the words almost lost in the cool Chicago morning air. "Just breathe, Claire. You've done harder things." The towering glass building of Hawthorne and Wilder rose ahead of her, sleek and intimidating in the early light. She'd stared at it for almost 5 minutes, trying to picture herself walking through those doors with confidence, trying to imagine she belonged here, but her reflection in the window, tired eyes, a soft crease forming between her brows, a scarf pulled too tightly around her neck, told a different story. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. She flinched. It was the assisted living facility. She didn't need to answer to know what it was about. Another form to sign, another payment deadline, another reminder that her mother's memory was fading faster than Claire could hold her life together. She answered anyway, forcing her voice steady. When she hung up, she pressed her forehead to the steering wheel and breathed deeply through the sting behind her eyes. She hadn't even stepped inside the building, and already the weight of the day pressed on her chest. The phone buzzed again. Her ex-husband this time. She hesitated, then swiped to answer. "Claire," Mark said, without preamble, "the last bill for the hospital visit is past due. They called me." "I know," she whispered. "You said you'd take care of it. I will. When I'm starting a new job today, I just need a little Claire. You always need a little. I can't keep covering what you can't handle." The words settled like dust she couldn't shake off. She closed her eyes and waited for the ache to pass. The familiar ache of being seen as a burden, of being reminded of every shortcoming, every failure she'd tried to outrun since the divorce. "I'll handle it," she repeated, though she wasn't sure how. She hung up before he could say anything else. When she opened her eyes, her gaze fell to the passenger seat. A medical invoice stuck out of her purse. The top edge creased from how many times she'd folded and unfolded it. She slid it back inside, as if the act alone could make it disappear. She straightened her shoulders and stepped out of the car. Inside the lobby, she felt small beneath the high ceilings and polished stone. People who seemed to know exactly where they were going moved past her in swift, confident strides. She clutched her onboarding packet like a life raft and approached the directory. but the list of floors and departments blurred when she tried to decipher them. Her throat tightened. This job was her last real shot. After the layoffs at the district office, after packing up years of interpreting materials and shutting the door on a career she'd loved but couldn't hold on to, she didn't get to fail again. Not when rent, medical payments, and her mother's care all hung by a fraying thread. She found the elevator, but when the doors opened and a group of employees stepped out, her nerves wavered. She offered a tentative smile to a woman with a coffee cup, but the woman didn't notice her. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't think Claire mattered. She pressed the wrong floor button first, then the right one, then forgot to step out when the doors opened. A young man held the door with a polite nod, and she rushed out, grateful and embarrassed. The hallways felt like a maze built for people who already belonged. Claire kept her head down, hoping her uncertainty wasn't obvious, but every polished surface reflected her unease back at her. She passed a line of framed photographs, company milestones, ribbon cuttings, plaques for awards she didn't understand. At the end of the hall, another corridor branched, and she hesitated again, unsure which direction would lead her to the employee conference room. Signs pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. Her pulse quickened. She could feel the old fear rising, the kind that told her she was the wrong person in the wrong place. Too late in life to be starting over. She spotted a door with a symbol she assumed was a restroom, its frosted glass catching the hallway lights. Relief washed through her. A moment to breathe, to pull herself together, to wipe the shine of nerves from her face. She pushed it open. Warm, perfumed air enveloped her instantly. Not the sterile scent of a corporate bathroom, but eucalyptus, the kind her mother's physical therapist used years ago, back when things were simpler. The memory struck her too quickly, too sharply. This wasn't a restroom. This was something else, something private, serene, untouched by the frantic pace of the world outside. Her gaze swept over marble counters, soft lighting, and neatly folded towels that looked too expensive to touch. She knew, with a certainty that tightened her stomach, that she had made a mistake, a big one. Her heart pounded as she stepped backward, ready to leave before anyone noticed she'd wandered in, before the consequences could catch her, before her first day spiraled beyond repair. But then she heard the water shut off, and when she turned, she saw him. Not the CEO she'd only read about, not the powerful figure from glossy company brochures, just a man standing still in a cloud of steam, holding the edge of the counter like it was the only thing anchoring him. A man whose eyes carried something she recognized too well, someone trying to keep his own world from slipping. Her breath stalled. She should have left. She knew she should have. But in that suspended moment, the truth hit her harder than embarrassment or fear. This wasn't simply a restricted room. It was a sanctuary, his sanctuary. And she had walked straight into a part of him the world wasn't meant to see. She swallowed hard, a single question echoing in her mind as she stood frozen in the doorway. What kind of pain made a man like him need a place like this locked away, hidden on a floor no one could reach? Daniel Hawthorne never let anyone see him without armor. The suit, the polished shoes, the unreadable expression. Those were the pieces he wore like a second skin, the parts of himself he trusted to face the world. Behind them, the man underneath stayed hidden, tucked away in corners no one was allowed to enter. The steam room was the exception. It was the only place he ever allowed himself to breathe. When he stepped out of the shower earlier that morning, the mist still hanging thick in the air, he'd expected silence, the kind that settled in his bones and soothed the tightness in his chest. Instead, he'd found a stranger standing in the doorway with wide, startled eyes, a woman who looked just as overwhelmed as he felt inside, though she tried hard to hide it. He hadn't been able to shake the moment since, now, back in his office. Daniel sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers resting on the edge of a closed folder he had not opened in months. His gaze drifted toward the bookshelf against the far wall. A single frame lay face down on the top shelf, its back coated with a thin layer of dust. He didn't need to lift it to see what was inside. He remembered every detail of that photograph, the way his wife's blonde hair caught the sun, the way his son's laughter had made the moment feel alive. He reached toward it, hesitating halfway. He hadn't touched that photo since the fire, since the betrayal, since everything in his life had divided cleanly into before and after. He let his hand fall. The building seemed too quiet today. The faint hum of the HVAC system, the soft clack of keyboards from the hallway, even the city sounds 30 floors below felt distant. Daniel exhaled slowly and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose, a gesture he used only when the pressure behind his ribs grew too sharp. He had rebuilt himself out of necessity, not strength. People called him disciplined, focused, unyielding, words offered with respect, sometimes fear. But none of them knew that what they praised was just debris from the life he'd lost, stacked like barriers so no one would come close enough to break him again. That was why the spa existed. It wasn't a luxury, though everyone assumed it was. It was a controlled environment, warm, quiet, dim, a place where the echoes of past panic couldn't reach him so easily. His doctor had recommended breathing exercises, meditation, grounding techniques. But Daniel had never spoken the full truth aloud. This room was the only place where he wasn't the CEO, the widower, the man who'd failed to protect his family. He was just a man trying to keep his heart from collapsing in on itself. And this morning, someone had walked in. Claire Dalton. He whispered her name under his breath before he realized it. She had looked at him with a kind of startled apology. Yes, but something else, too. Something unguarded. Her eyes had carried a familiar exhaustion, the kind that lived in the quiet parts of a person's life, the ones they didn't advertise. Daniel pushed away from the desk and stood. He crossed the office with measured steps and stopped beside the security monitor embedded discreetly in the wall. He told himself it was standard procedure. Someone had accessed a restricted floor. He needed to confirm how. He keyed in the timestamp and watched the footage play. The camera showed her stepping out of the elevator, scanning the floor with obvious confusion. She hesitated at the corridor, checking signs, clutching something close to her chest. Papers maybe? A folder? At one point, she stopped to steady her breath, her hand rising to her throat in a gesture that was all too familiar, one he had often made himself in the months after the fire. She wasn't careless. She was overwhelmed. His jaw tightened. He shouldn't care. He didn't have space in his life to care. Yet he found himself leaning slightly closer to the screen, studying the moment she paused at the door, the precise second she believed she'd found a restroom. There was no hesitation, no curiosity, nothing out of line, just a woman trying to survive her first day in an unfamiliar place. And he half-dressed, half recovering from the tightness in his chest, had met her in the most exposed moment of his routine. He looked away too quickly, fingers brushing the monitor as he shut it off. A flicker of warmth, or maybe guilt, pressed at the edges of his composure. He walked back to his desk, but he didn't sit. He paced once, then again, as if movement could stir clarity where his thoughts had tangled. Vulnerability unsettled him. It had been years since he let anyone look at him without the armor. Years since a stranger's presence had made something inside him shift. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the lingering heat from the steam session fade into the cool office air. Her expression when she saw him, mortification, yes, but also concern, kept replaying in his mind. Why did he care enough to check the footage he didn't have an answer? Or maybe he did, and it was simply a truth he wasn't ready to name. He returned to the bookshelf, stopping in front of the face-down photograph. His hand hovered above it again. The dust clung to the frame like a thin gray shroud. He closed his fingers slowly, letting the unresolved ache settle back into its usual place inside him. For years, he had managed to navigate his life with precision work, silence, occasional bouts of grief he smothered before anyone noticed. But one misstep from a stranger, a woman trying to find her way, had cracked something small and unexpected. And he didn't know what that meant yet. He stared out the window. The skyline reflected faintly in the glass. The day moved on without him, but his thoughts remained suspended, caught between past wounds and an unfamiliar pull he didn't have the language for. Somewhere down in the building, she was beginning her first day. Why did that matter? Why did she matter enough to unsettle the walls he'd spent years fortifying? The stack of documents landed on Claire's desk with a sound too heavy for paper. She stared at it, her fingers still curled around the coffee she hadn't touched yet. The top page was crisp, crowded with lines of text she recognized instantly German. The second page held Mandarin characters. The third, French. A neat note in black ink rested on top. 4 hours. Deliver to my office before noon. D.H. The message was brief, impersonal, and strangely elegant in its handwriting. Innocent enough at first glance. But as she lifted the first set of pages, the weight of the assignment settled in her chest like a stone. 300 pages, 3 languages, cultural variations, legal phrasing that left no margin for error. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself that she'd survived more impossible days than this court hearings during her divorce. Emergency calls from her mother's facility. Nights when the world felt too big and she felt too small. She placed her coffee aside and rolled her shoulders back, pulling the desk lamp a little closer so its warm glow pooled over the papers. "All right," she whispered to herself. "Let's do this." For the next hour, the office around her faded. She moved with quiet focus, her fingers steady on the keyboard, her eyes scanning each sentence twice before she translated it. German required precision, Mandarin required sensitivity to tone and nuance, French needed rhythm. She fell into an old rhythm she hadn't touched since her school district days, a kind of mental steadiness that always made her feel more capable than she believed herself to be. Still, doubt crept in at the edges. What if this is too much? What if I'm too slow? What if he thinks I'm not worth the trouble? She pushed the thoughts aside and kept going. The desk lamp hummed faintly. Papers shifted under her hands. Outside the window, the Chicago sky brightened, then dulled with passing clouds. She didn't stop except to stretch her fingers and blink away the blur. By 11:40, her pulse picked up. She reviewed the last section one more time. Everything looked clean, consistent, respectful of the cultural context. She printed the pages, organized them into neat sections, and smoothed the top page with her palm. 4 hours. She had made it with 20 minutes to spare. As she walked toward Daniel's office, her legs felt lighter and heavier at the same time. The hallway seemed longer than it had that morning. She paused at the door, drew in a breath, and knocked. "Come in." His voice always carried that even calm, controlled, precise. She stepped inside. Daniel sat at his desk, back straight, sleeves rolled up just slightly, the shadows beneath his eyes faint but unmistakable. He didn't look up until she placed the documents in front of him. "You're early," he said. "I wanted to leave room for review," she replied. Her voice stayed steady, though her heart hadn't caught up. Daniel picked up the first page. Claire stood still, hands clasped, trying to appear composed while the room's quiet pressed on her. His eyes moved steadily across the lines. He flipped to the next page, then the next, the faint rustle of paper sounding louder than footsteps in a church. Minutes stretched. Claire felt the old, familiar tightness gather beneath her ribs, the one that whispered she wasn't enough, that she would slip somehow, that someone would notice she didn't truly belong in places like this. He paused halfway through the French section and looked at her. "Did you cross-reference the legal terminology?" "Yes. And the cultural phrasing in the Mandarin section. I worked with both formal and modern business conventions." His gaze lowered to the page again. She couldn't read his expression, it never gave much away. But she saw something shift, barely there, like the smallest exhale of tension. He reached the last page, set the stack down with deliberate care, and rested his fingers on the edges. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she expected. "This is exceptional work, Ms. Dalton." A warmth flickered across her chest. Surprise, relief, something gentler too. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, his face composed but not cold. Something in his eyes softened an echo of recognition. Maybe, as if her steadiness under pressure reminded him of someone he used to know, someone who once stood in the center of his life with grace and unshakable calm. Most people freeze when given this volume, he said. You didn't. I've had a lot of practice being the steady one, she answered before she could stop herself. His gaze sharpened, not with displeasure but curiosity. The steady one. She hesitated, then offered a faint smile. Life has a way of training you. For a moment, the room felt different, less corporate, more human. He didn't ask anything further, but a shadow crossed his expression, something she sensed rather than understood. He looked down at the documents again, his thumb tracing one corner as if grounding himself. He closed the folder and leaned back slightly. You handled the pressure well. Thank you. I'm still catching up with the building layout, but the work itself, I can do. His jaw tightened a little, a flicker she almost missed. She wondered if she had said something wrong, but no. This was something internal, something he carried. He nodded once. You may go. She turned to leave, feeling steadier than she had all morning, until his voice stopped her. Ms. Dalton. She slowed, her hand still on the doorframe. His eyes held hers with an intensity she hadn't expected, not harsh, not demanding, but searching, as though her competence unsettled something in him more deeply than any mistake would have. He didn't finish the thought, didn't explain the look. He simply returned his gaze to the papers, as if the answer lay somewhere in the lines she had translated. Claire stepped into the hallway, her breath caught between pride and a faint ache she couldn't name. She walked slowly, the quiet question echoing through her as she made her way back to her desk. Why would her steadiness bother him, and why did she care that it did? The moment the waiter lifted the champagne tray, Daniel stopped breathing. It happened so quickly. 1 second, he was standing beneath the golden glow of the chandelier, performing polite greetings. And the next, everything inside him twisted. His jaw tightened first, then his shoulders, then the hand holding his water glass. Claire noticed the glass tremble before he steadied it, as though he hadn't meant for anyone to see. But she saw. She always seemed to notice the things he tried hardest to hide. The gala unfolded in the restored Majestic Theater, a century-old Chicago landmark with sweeping balconies and velvet curtains that draped like dark wine. Music drifted from the small orchestra near the stage, soft, elegant, the kind designed to fill space without demanding attention. Guests moved like a river of polished shoes and formal gowns. Claire stood near the edge of the room, helping visiting donors navigate the event, but her focus kept sliding toward Daniel. He maneuvered the gathering with practiced grace, every nod and handshake controlled. But when a young waiter approached him, crystal flutes glittering under the lights, something changed. Daniel's back stiffened, his eyes locked on the champagne. Not in interest, but in a kind of quiet panic, raw, unmasked, instantaneous. Claire's breath caught. No one else noticed, or if they did, they politely ignored it, the way people often ignored pain that didn't belong to them. But to Claire, the shift was unmistakable. It was as if a bruise had been pressed, one hidden under layers of self-control. Daniel murmured an excuse she couldn't hear. Then he stepped away from the crowd, threading through the guests until he slipped out onto a side balcony. Claire didn't hesitate. She followed. The evening air was cool, brushing against her skin like a welcome relief after the warmth inside. The balcony overlooked the city, its lights shimmering in the river below. Daniel stood near the railing, hands braced on the metal, shoulders rigid. His breath formed a faint cloud in the night air. She approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He didn't turn, but she felt him register her presence. "There are guests who may need you," he said, his voice roughened at the edges. "They can wait." A long pause followed. Then he exhaled, the sound thin and exhausted. "It's just champagne," he muttered. "It wasn't just champagne to you," she said gently. His fingers tightened on the railing. "You notice too much." "I notice what hurts," she replied. That made him look at her, The theater's golden light spilled out through the balcony doors and brushed the side of his face, revealing the tension carving faint lines around his eyes. He looked older in that moment, not in years, but in heaviness. He glanced down, almost as if searching for the words on the floor between them. When he finally spoke, it was quieter than she'd ever heard him. 5 years ago, he began. I stood at another gala, holding a champagne glass, almost identical to the ones tonight. His voice paused, catching briefly. My wife and son were at a company event across town. I didn't know the plant they were visiting had been compromised. His throat worked against the memory. A fire broke out. Chemical. Fast. No time for anyone to get out. Claire felt her heart drop, the ache spreading through her chest like cold water. There were signs afterward. He continued. Financial footprints that didn't belong. A partner, someone I trusted, had been stealing formulas from our labs. The fire was meant to cover it. They didn't intend. He swallowed hard. But intentions don't bring back the dead. Claire stepped closer, the hem of her gown whispering across the balcony floor. Daniel. He shook his head once, eyes burning with quiet restraint. Every year since, champagne has felt like a reminder, a celebration frozen in time. The night, the world split in two. Wind brushed past them, carrying the faint roar of traffic from the street below. Claire reached out, slowly, giving him every chance to step away. He didn't. When her hand rested over his fingers were cold, tense, as though he'd been holding the railing too tightly for too long. Grief doesn't leave on command, she said. He closed his eyes at the touch, his breath unsteady. She felt the smallest movement, his hand turning, just enough to let his fingers graze hers. A quiet acceptance, a fragile permission. You shouldn't have to hear this, he murmured. You shouldn't have to carry it alone. A faint tremor passed through him, not enough for others to see, enough for her to feel. He didn't look at her, but his voice softened, almost breaking. I don't let people in. Claire, I don't know how anymore. She squeezed his hand gently. Then let this be a beginning, not a burden. Another breath shuddered through him. For a moment, the world narrowed to the warmth of her hand around his, the night sky stretching above them, and the city lights flickering like distant hope. It was the first human connection he'd allowed in years. He opened his eyes and looked at her, not with the guarded distance he wore in the office, but with something bare and searching, something that asked quietly, what now Claire didn't answer. She didn't know. As the orchestra swelled behind the balcony doors and laughter drifted faintly from the gala, Daniel slowly pulled his hand back, not abruptly, but with hesitation, as if unsure whether he wanted the moment to end. Tomorrow would come. And she didn't know whether he would act as if this night had never happened, or whether something irreversible had quietly begun. Some silences felt cold. This one felt warm and dangerous. Claire sensed it the moment she stepped into the office the morning after the gala. The building hummed with its usual weekday rhythm, heels clicking on polished floors, phones ringing softly behind glass doors, printers warming up like distant machinery. Yet beneath that normalcy was an undercurrent she couldn't shake, quiet and charged, like static before a storm. She saw Daniel only briefly at first. He walked through the reception area with his usual composed stride, nodding once to an employee who greeted him. Nothing about him looked out of place. Suit impeccable, posture steady, expression calm. But when his eyes met hers across the room, something flinched in his gaze. Not rejection, not discomfort, something more tangled. He looked away first. Claire lowered her eyes, pretending to review the mail in her hands. Her pulse quickened anyway. They didn't speak that day, or the day after. Each time she passed his office, she hesitated not long enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to feel the weight of the moment on the balcony lingering like a faint scent on her skin. She replayed his voice cracking as he spoke of his wife and son, felt the way his hand had trembled beneath hers. She remembered the warmth of his fingers brushing back before he pulled away. Unsure, had she stepped too close? Had she crossed a boundary she didn't understand? On Wednesday morning, the doubt pressed heavier. Her inbox was filled with assignments from different departments, but none from Daniel. He didn't call for her, didn't ask for her translations, didn't request her presence at meetings. It was as if he was creating space necessary. Space. Deserved space, but space all the same. By noon, a tight ache had settled beneath her ribs. At her desk, Claire turned her badge over in her hands, letting it swing softly from its lanyard. She had started over once before, after the divorce, after the layoffs, after the long months of caring for her mother while the world kept moving without her. She could do it again, if this was too complicated or too painful for him. But the thought stung more than it should have. She stood, walked toward HR, then stopped halfway down the hall. Her steps slowed as she noticed the reflection in the glass wall beside her. Daniel stood inside his office, facing her direction. His posture was rigid, but his expression, she couldn't see it, clearly held something unsettled. Their eyes met through the glass. He didn't look away. For one suspended second, neither moved. The world outside the office, a ringing phone, a distant elevator chime seemed to dim. He stayed where he was, hand resting on the edge of his desk, gaze fixed on her as though deciding something he hadn't been ready to face. Claire felt her heartbeat slow, then thrum stronger, as if her body recognized the tension before her mind could name it. Did he regret confiding in her? Or was he watching because he didn't know how to begin again? She didn't wait to find out. She turned, walking back toward her desk, cheeks warming. She sat down carefully, each movement deliberate, the way one might handle a fragile object without knowing which part was most breakable. The afternoon unfolded quietly. She translated a set of internal memos, typed notes from last week's department meeting, prepared briefs for Thursday's training. Every so often, she sensed movement behind Daniel's glass walls as if he walked to the door, almost stepped out, then retreated. Around 3, a small folder appeared on her desk. No note, just a collection of documents, clipped neatly, with his initials at the corner. Her breath caught. He had reached out, carefully, cautiously, but it was something. She touched the folder as though it were warm. The pages inside dealt with a new international project requiring multi-language review. Straightforward, professional, entirely normal. Yet, the way he offered it, silent, almost tentative, carried its own meaning. That evening, most employees filtered out of the building as shadows stretched across the floors. Claire gathered her things slowly, as she slipped her mother's most recent invoice into her purse and closed her laptop. She heard a soft sound, a door clicking shut somewhere down the hall. She stepped out just in time to see Daniel walking toward the private elevator. His suit jacket rested over his arm. The faint lines of fatigue traced his shoulders, but something gentler softened his expression when he noticed her. He nodded once, a greeting, a recognition, but also an unspoken question. Claire returned the nod, feeling her breath hitch in her chest. The hallway felt too wide and too narrow all at once. 2 doors closed behind them, at different moments, hers first, then his, a soft echo that seemed to underline the quiet distance they still hadn't bridged. As she stepped into the main lobby, Claire paused by the large window overlooking the street. Evening traffic streamed beneath the building, red taillights flickering like tiny heartbeats. She watched them for a moment, wondering if she had imagined everything, his hesitation, his watching her. The folder placed on her desk without a word. Maybe she had read too much into it, but then again, maybe not. The memory of his hand in hers surfaced, unbidden, a warmth she could still feel if she closed her eyes. She tightened her grip on her purse strap, trying to steady her breath. Some silences chilled a room, but this one, this fragile, uncertain quiet between them, felt like standing close to a door half open. Not enough to cross, not enough to close, just enough to wonder or to hope. Paris was supposed to be business, yet the moment Claire stepped out of the taxi and saw the soft afternoon light brushing the limestone buildings, everything between her and Daniel felt newly fragile, newly awake. The city breathed around them, elegant and unhurried, a world away from Chicago's sharp edges. She watched as Daniel stood on the hotel's front steps, speaking quietly to the driver, the faint breeze ruffling the edges of his coat. He looked different here, less contained, almost softened by distance. When he turned toward her, his eyes lingered a beat too long. The day moved quickly after that. Their first meeting took place in an airy conference room overlooking the Seine. The French executives arrived warm and charming, with an ease Claire envied. She took her place beside Daniel, translating nuances, smoothing over cultural edges, keeping the conversation moving. Each time she spoke, Daniel's posture shifted, as if steadier for having her there. She felt it, and she tried not to. During a break, one of the executives, Laurent Marchand, silver-haired and charming in a polished, unmistakably French way, approached her with a smile that reached his eyes. He asked about her background, praised her skill, complimented her pronunciation. It was polite, effortless, the kind of flirting that lived in tone more than words. Claire laughed softly, answering in French. It felt harmless. But in her periphery, she sensed Daniel watching. She didn't turn toward him, yet she felt the tension coming off him like a current, subtle, but steady. When she finally glanced his way, his expression was neutral, but his jaw was set, the muscle tightening once before he looked at the view outside. After the break, the negotiations resumed smoothly. Claire's translations helped bridge a misunderstanding that could have derailed everything. Daniel acknowledged it with a quiet nod that felt almost like gratitude and almost like something more. By late afternoon, they finished for the day and rode back to the hotel. The lobby glowed with golden light, guests murmuring in several languages, suitcases rolling softly over marble. Claire could still hear Laurent's laughter in her head from when he'd said goodbye. She shook it off, trying not to think about whether Daniel had noticed anything at all. Upstairs, the elevator doors closed behind them. The space was small, mirrored on all sides, filled with the faint scent of cologne and the city's cool air clinging to their coats. Claire pressed the button for their floor and stepped to one side. Daniel stood a careful distance from her, hands in his pockets, gaze straight ahead. Yet she felt something shifting, like a thin thread pulling taut between them. "You handled yourself well today," he said quietly. "Thank you," she replied. Everyone was very gracious. His brow lifted slightly, some more than others. She blinked, unsure how to respond. Laurent was just being polite. "I wasn't aware politeness required touching your arm twice," Daniel said, eyes still forward, her breath caught. He was just, "I know what he was doing," he murmured. There was no anger in his voice, just a tightness she hadn't heard before, something she couldn't decide was frustration or something else entirely. Before Claire could form an answer, the elevator shuddered. The lights flickered once, then again, then went out. She grabbed the railing, heart leaping into her throat as the elevator ground to a stop. Emergency lights kicked in, bathing the space in a soft blue glow. The building hummed faintly around them, but the elevator itself stayed still. Daniel pressed the emergency button. A voice reassured them. Help was on the way. Power issue. Temporary. Nothing dangerous. Claire breathed out slowly, trying to steady her hands. "I'm sorry," she said softly, forcing out a nervous laugh. "I don't usually panic. You're all right," Daniel said, voice low. "It's just temporary." He stepped a little closer, not invading her space, just closing enough distance to show he was present. The calm in his tone startled her. He wasn't distant or closed off. He wasn't wearing any armor at all. He was simply there. The emergency lights made his features gentler. She saw the faint stubble on his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the quiet exhaustion he rarely let slip. He held himself carefully, as if afraid one wrong move would change the nature of the space between them. The elevator hummed once, trying to restart, then fell quiet again. Claire exhaled. Daniel watched her closely. "You were tense today," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't deny it. It wasn't about the meeting. Her pulse kicked. He turned toward her fully now, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding something unguarded. "When Laurent was talking to you," he said slowly, "were you comfortable?" She hesitated. Yes, he was harmless. Still, Daniel murmured. I didn't like it. The air shifted. Claire's breath caught as the blue emergency light washed across his face, casting shadows that made his guarded expression look almost vulnerable. Daniel, she whispered. He looked down briefly as if torn, then met her eyes again. You weren't imagining what happened on the balcony, he said, and I haven't been able to forget it. Something inside Claire softened slowly, painfully, beautifully. Before either could speak again, the elevator jolted, lights flickering back to life. The car lurched upward, humming steadily as if nothing had happened, but everything had. When the doors opened onto their floor, neither moved for a moment. Daniel stepped out first, pausing as though wanting to say something more but unable to find the words. Claire followed, her heart unsteady, her thoughts a swirl of hope and fear. The hallway stretched ahead, quiet, carpeted, lined with soft lights. But the question lingered like a whisper in the air between them. What truths surface when the world suddenly goes still? The blue emergency light softened every hard edge on Daniel's face, making him look younger and unbearably tired. Claire saw it the instant the elevator settled into that suspended quiet, the hum of the building fading until all she could hear was the faint sound of their breathing. He stood only a few feet from her, but something about the dim glow made the distance feel thinner, almost fragile. I shouldn't have said anything, he murmured. His voice carried a roughness she hadn't heard before, as if he were trying to hold several things together at once. About earlier, about what I felt. Claire steadied herself with a hand against the cool metal wall. You weren't wrong, she said softly. I felt it too. He exhaled, a quiet, uneven breath. That's what unsettles me. For a moment, neither spoke, then his eyes dark, steady. Searching lifted to hers. You see through me, he said, even when I don't want anyone to. She swallowed. I don't try to. That's the problem. The emergency light flickered just enough to cast a trembling shadow across his features. The honesty in his expression startled her. Daniel Hawthorne was a man who built his life around control, precision, composure, walls that no one was allowed to touch. But here, in a stalled elevator in a foreign city, he wasn't hiding behind any of it. He leaned a shoulder against the wall, looking down as if gathering courage. For 5 years, he said, I've done everything I could to feel nothing. I worked, I slept, I survived the hours, but nothing touched me. Not grief, not anger, not hope. I went numb because it was easier. Claire felt the words settle into her chest, heavy and warm. She took a tentative step closer, drawn by something she didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. What changed, she asked. He lifted his gaze again, and the way he looked at her made her heart stumble. You walked into that spa, he said. You were startled, embarrassed, apologizing for something that wasn't your fault. And for the first time in years, I felt something. A spark, a shift. I didn't want it, I didn't ask for it, but it was there. Her breath caught not because his words were flattering, but because they were raw, unguarded, honest in a way that bent the air between them. Daniel, she whispered. He didn't move closer, but he didn't back away either. The small space made every inhale feel shared, every second stretched thin. It scares me, he said quietly. How easily you read me. How quickly you quiet the noise I've lived with for so long. I don't know what to do with that. Something gentle broke open inside her, not pity, not sympathy, but a deeper, more dangerous tenderness. She reached out before she had time to second guess, her fingertips brushing the side of his face. His skin was warm beneath her touch, and she felt him still, as though he didn't trust himself to breathe. Daniel, she said softly, you're allowed to feel again. His eyes closed, just for a heartbeat. It was enough. He leaned lightly into her touch, and the closeness of that small gesture sent a quiet ache through her. Claire felt the moment gathering around them like a held breath, like the pause before a confession they both understood but hadn't yet spoken aloud. His hand lifted slowly, hesitantly, as if seeking permission before landing gently at her waist. Not pulling, not assuming, just there. Her pulse fluttered. The dim blue light caught the faint tremor in his fingers. They were standing so close now that she could feel the warmth of him, the quiet steadiness beneath his fear. Her thumb traced the edge of his cheekbone, and she felt him exhale through his nose slow, shakier than he wanted her to see. Without planning to, without even thinking, she leaned in until their foreheads hovered a breath apart. He opened his eyes, and the vulnerability in them was almost unbearable. "Claire," he whispered, voice barely there. The space between them collapsed into a fragile, trembling closeness. If either of them leaned the smallest fraction forward, there would be no turning back. Claire could feel his breath warm against her lips. She could feel her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. For the first time in years, Daniel Hawthorne wasn't holding himself together. He was letting himself fall. Then the elevator jolted, lights flashed bright, humming back to full power. The floor lurched beneath their feet. Claire gasped, losing her balance for the smallest second. Daniel's hand tightened at her waist, steadying her. Their foreheads brushed barely, accidentally, but the spark of contact shot straight through her. The moment shattered. Daniel released her slowly, almost reluctantly. She stepped back just enough to breathe, her hand dropping from his face, fingers trembling. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet ding. Daniel didn't move, neither did she. Everything felt changed too big, too real, too dangerous to name. He finally spoke, voice low and rough. "We crossed a line, didn't we?" Claire didn't answer. She couldn't, because the truth was standing right there between them, warm and unsteady, asking questions neither of them knew how to face. When they finally stepped out, the hallway felt colder, the world suddenly too wide, too bright. But the question lingered with every step they took in opposite directions. What happens now that there's no way to pretend the line never existed? The silence was the first thing she noticed. It settled around Claire as she stepped inside her small Chicago apartment. The kind of silence that didn't soothe, but reminded her how long she'd been carrying everything alone. She closed the door gently behind her, letting her suitcase rest by the wall, and listened to the soft hum of the refrigerator, her only welcome home. A single lamp glowed in the living room, casting a warm circle of light over the cluttered coffee table. Medical bills, insurance letters, prescription reminders. Nothing had moved since she left for Paris, and somehow that stillness felt heavier tonight. She slipped off her shoes, her body aching from the flight, from the tension she'd been holding since the elevator door opened and Daniel walked away as if a part of him was afraid to look back. Her mother's assisted living facility had left 3 voicemails. Claire didn't need to listen to know the tone polite, strained, concerned. She pressed play anyway, each message repeating the same subtle worry that her mother's memory had slipped again, that she'd wandered into another resident's room, that she'd refused medication until a nurse coaxed her. Claire sank onto the couch, running a hand through her hair. Paris already felt unreal, as if it belonged to another version of her, someone lighter, someone less tired. The softness in Daniel's eyes when he admitted how she unsettled him still lingered in her mind. His voice, quiet in that blue-lit elevator, had wrapped around her in a way she hadn't expected, hadn't dared to hope for. But here, surrounded by unpaid bills and the weight of responsibilities she could never ignore, the fragile possibility of whatever existed between them felt impossibly distant. Her phone buzzed. She didn't check it right away. She stared at the ceiling instead, letting her breath settle. It took a long moment before she reached for the phone and saw the name Daniel Hawthorne. Her thumb hovered over the screen. He had texted earlier. Something brief. "Let me know when you get home." Simple, thoughtful, dangerous. She typed back, "I'm home. Thank you." Then hesitated before sending it. When she finally did, the message felt like it drifted into a space between them that neither of them had the courage to define. She stood and walked into the kitchen, filling a glass with water. Her hands shook slightly, exhaustion threading through her bones. She thought of Daniel's hand at her waist, the quiet warmth of his breath, the way his voice had cracked when he told her he hadn't felt anything in years. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something alive, something delicate and real. She wasn't sure she had room for it. The knock on her door startled her, a small jump, water sloshing over her fingers. She wiped her hand on a towel and walked cautiously to the door. Through the peephole, she saw no one, just the empty hallway. Then she looked down. A paper bag sat neatly on the floor, a sticker from a nearby diner sealing it closed. Attached was a small note in handwriting she didn't recognize. In case you're too tired to cook, D. Her breath caught. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't romantic or bold. It was simple, quiet, kind. A gesture from a man who didn't know how to say the things he felt but wanted to try anyway. She picked up the bag, her heart tightening in her chest. It was too thoughtful, too gentle, the kind of thing that made hope stir, even when she tried to tamp it down. As she stepped back inside, her phone rang this time, with a number she knew too well, the assisted living facility. Her pulse dropped. She answered immediately. "This is Claire." A nurse spoke calmly, but the tremor beneath her words was unmistakable. Claire listened as her stomach slowly knotted. Her mother had fallen, not badly, but enough to bruise her hip and frighten the staff, enough that they needed Claire's authorization for a hospital evaluation if her mother showed further signs of confusion. "Has she been asking for me?" Claire asked quietly. There was a pause. All day. Claire closed her eyes. "I'll come first thing in the morning," she said. After hanging up, she stood in the middle of her apartment, the paper bag still in her hand, her shoulders slumping under a familiar weight. Her mother's health had been in slow decline for months, and the signs had grown more troubling. Recently misplaced names, forgotten meals, moments of drifting elsewhere, and now a fall. The warmth she felt earlier dissolved into something sharper. Fear. Duty. The reminder that her life wasn't simple, wasn't light enough for a man like Daniel Hawthorne to step into easily. She sat back down on the couch, the takeout bag beside her, untouched. How could she even think of whatever was happening between her and Daniel, when her mother needed her, when money was tight, when every decision she made felt like it carried someone else's weight? Her phone buzzed again. It was Daniel, but the text stopped her breath. "Did something happen? You seem distant." She stared at the message, her chest tightening, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could tell him the truth. She could open that door, or she could close it before either of them stepped too far. Voices from the elevator whispered through her memory. His confession, the warmth in his touch, the exhaustion in his eyes. Every part of her wanted to answer honestly, but the question pressed in hard and unrelenting. Would he step closer if he knew how complicated her life really was? Or would this be the moment he stepped back? She didn't type anything. She simply sat there, the quiet stretching long around her, waiting to see if this fragile connection could survive the weight of her world. The first phrase looked harmless, just a line in a dense financial report. Another sentence tucked into a German clause she had translated a dozen times before. Claire didn't even pause until the repetition appeared. Again, different document, different language, identical shape beneath the words. She leaned back slowly, the glow of her desk lamp softening the edges of the papers spread across her kitchen table. Outside, Chicago's late evening traffic hummed faintly, a muted reminder that the world kept moving even when her own came to a halt. She traced the line with her fingertip, a simple idiom on the surface, a subtle, coded signal underneath. Her pulse quickened. She had heard that phrasing before, in a quiet balcony confession whispered between shadows and moonlight. Daniel had described the coded language investigators found years ago, buried in documents surrounding the explosion that stole his family. He hadn't meant it as a clue for her to follow, just part of a story he never told anyone. But the patterns he described, the unusual cadence, the odd repetition had settled somewhere deep in her mind. And now, They were here, in front of her, in merger drafts tied to the same division where his betrayal once took root. She swallowed, rubbing her thumb over the edge of a page. She wanted to believe she was mistaken, that fatigue was tricking her eyes. After all, she hadn't slept well since coming home. Between her mother's fall and Daniel's messages waiting unanswered on her phone, she barely had the strength to keep her thoughts straight. But the phrases didn't disappear. She opened another document, and there it was again, woven into a paragraph that didn't need it, foreign enough that only someone who lived in languages the way she did would notice. Claire's stomach tightened. She looked at the clock. Nearly 9 p. The office was still open at this hour. Daniel was probably there. He often stayed late, working long after the floor went quiet, chasing order in a world that once betrayed him at the deepest level. She thought of the quiet fear in his voice when he told her how much he had lost, of the way he leaned into her touch in the elevator, not out of desire, but from some fragile instinct to trust again. Would bringing this to him help him or break him? She exhaled slowly and closed her eyes. Every instinct she had told her the same thing he deserved to know. But another part of her, a gentler part, hesitated. He had just started letting someone in. Just started breathing without armor. Was she about to take that away from him? A small tremor moved through her fingers. She pushed the documents into a neater stack, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The lamp's warm light made the pages glow, and each repeated phrase seemed to stare back at her, urging her to act. She reached for her phone, her thumb drifting over his name. She imagined calling him, imagined his voice, low and steady, perhaps confused, perhaps already bracing for something he couldn't name. But she couldn't do it over the phone. If she was going to tear open this wound, if that was what this would be, she needed to look him in the eyes when she did. She gathered the documents, slipping them into her work bag. Each page felt heavier than paper should. She took a breath, grabbed her coat, and stepped into the hallway. The late-night hum of the elevator echoed softly as she descended. By the time she reached the building, the lobby was nearly empty. Only the security guard nodded as she passed. The upper floors were dim, most lights off for the night. Daniel's office, though, still glowed with that familiar warm lamp he kept on his desk. She paused outside the glass wall, the way he had paused when watching her earlier that week. He was at his desk, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the computer screen with an intensity that made her chest ache. He looked tired, not the kind of tired sleep could fix, but the kind that lived in his bones. For a moment, she considered turning back, letting him have one more night of peace, one more night untouched by the storm gathering inside her bag. But truth didn't wait, and neither could she. She knocked gently. Daniel looked up sharply, surprise flickering across his face before something warmer replaced it. Relief. Maybe, or worry. She couldn't tell. "Claire," he said, rising slightly from his chair. "Is everything all right?" Her throat tightened at the question. No, nothing felt all right anymore. "I need to show you something," she managed. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The soft click echoed louder than she intended. She approached his desk slowly, placing the stack of papers in front of him. He glanced at them, confusion deepening. "What is this?" She swallowed. "Language patterns. In the merger documents. I noticed them tonight." He leaned closer, scanning the top page, his brow furrowed, and her voice softened. "It's the same phrasing you told me about, from before." The room felt suddenly too still. Daniel's hands froze on the paper. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with recognition. A slow, haunted recognition that made Claire's breath hitch. He sat back, the air thinning between them. His jaw tightened as he looked at her, searching for something certainty. Denial. Maybe the hope that she had misread everything. "Claire," he said slowly, carefully. "Are you absolutely sure?" She nodded once. He looked away, his breath leaving in a quiet, painful exhale. She watched him gather himself, watched the walls he'd started to lower rise again inch by inch as he tried to process the weight of what she'd brought him. "Why did you bring this to me?" he asked, his voice rougher now. "You didn't have to." "I did," she whispered, "because it's connected to your past, and because you deserve to know when something isn't right." He stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, something wounded, something grateful, something afraid. Claire felt a tremor of doubt move through her. Had she done the right thing, or had she just opened a door that was never meant to be touched? Daniel lowered his gaze to the papers again, his fingers curling against the edge. "What I do with this," he said quietly, "it could change everything." Her heart pounded. For him, for her, for both of them. And the question settled heavy in the room. When he turned to face the truth, would he turn toward her, or away? Daniel didn't move at first, not even a breath. The dim light from his desk lamp carved shadows across his face as he stared at the documents Claire had placed before him. The same documents that had stolen the softness from his expression a moment earlier. She watched his hands hover above the pages as if they were something that could burn him. "They use the same language," he murmured. The words barely reached her, but she heard every one, the exact same. His voice wasn't angry. It was hollow, like something inside him had cracked open. Claire felt her own pulse stumble as she stepped closer. She didn't touch him. She didn't dare. She only stood near enough that he wouldn't feel alone. "It's connected to the new merger group," she said softly. "I found the phrasing in their internal drafts." Daniel closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was a kind of fire she hadn't seen before, not wild, not uncontrolled, but resolute. A fire that came from a man who had survived something unimaginable and finally saw the truth of it. "I should have seen it," he said. "I should have known." "You couldn't," Claire replied. "Not alone." Something flickered across his features, gratitude, maybe, or pain before he straightened, gathering the documents with trembling hands. He didn't bother with his coat. He didn't look at the clock. He simply said, "Come with me." She followed him down the hallway, her footsteps echoing behind his. The late hour made the glass walls reflect them like shadows, two people walking into a storm. Daniel tapped his badge to the boardroom door, and the heavy panel slid open with a muted click. The long table gleamed beneath recessed lights. 12 leather chairs ringed it, empty but expectant, like the walls themselves knew what was coming. Daniel walked to the head of the table, placed the documents down, and pulled out his phone. "Wake them," he said to his assistant downstairs. "All of them. 10 minutes." He hung up without another word. Claire stood at the far side of the room, watching him. She could feel the tension radiating from him. Not frantic, but focused, like a man who had spent years drowning quietly and suddenly found a rope in his hands. One by one, members of the board filtered in rumpled jackets, half-buttoned coats, annoyed expressions. They paused when they saw Claire, then froze when their eyes shifted to Daniel. Something in his posture silenced the room. "What's the meaning of this?" one director demanded. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he slid the stack of documents across the polished table. The pages spread out like cards in a game no one wanted to play. "I need all of you to read," he said. A murmur rose, then fell again when they saw the look on his face. Claire stayed silent as they scanned the pages. She watched shock ripple through the men and women around the table. Some frowned, others stiffened, one pale-faced executive the head of international partnerships. The man who had pushed hardest for the merger did not move at all. Daniel noticed. "You recognize the pattern," he said quietly. The man swallowed. "I don't know what you mean." Daniel placed a hand on the back of a chair, as if grounding himself. "It's the same coded language used in the sabotage that killed my wife and son. The same team behind that betrayal now stands behind this merger. And you," his voice sharpened, "have been the one pushing for it." The room erupted gasps, accusations, a wave of disbelief. The executive's face drained of color. "This is absurd. You're making connections that don't exist." Claire watched Daniel's jaw tighten. For a moment, she worried he'd lose control, that the weight of 5 years of grief would break through in anger. But he didn't. He lifted one document, tapping the repeated phrase. "This idiom," he said steadily, "appeared in falsified safety reports before the explosion. Investigators flagged it as a linguistic signature. Those files were sealed, known only to a handful of us. He turned the page toward the room. It appears here again. The man at the far end pushed back from the table. Coincidence? Daniel took a step forward. Then explain why a company with prior ties to sabotage is now acting through you. Explain why these patterns lead directly back to your overseas contacts. This is look. You're grieving. He didn't finish. Two security officers stepped into the room, summoned silently by Daniel's assistant. They stood waiting, tension thick in their stillness. Daniel nodded once. Escort him out. Suspend all of his credentials. He is to be held until authorities arrive. The man sputtered, shouted, tried to reach for his briefcase, but the guards moved quickly, firmly. His protests echoed down the hallway as they dragged him away. Silence rushed in behind him. The board looked at Daniel, not as their CEO, but as a man who had just torn open a wound and chosen truth over fear. Claire watched his shoulders rise and fall once, a long, shuddering breath leaving him. For the first time since she had known him, he didn't seem crushed by the weight he carried. He seemed freed by it. One director cleared her throat. Daniel, how long will this investigation reach? As far as it needs to, he said. No matter who falls. They all nodded. No one challenged him. The room slowly emptied, murmurs trailing behind them like fading smoke. Claire remained where she was, unsure if she should move, unsure if he wanted her close or needed space to breathe. Daniel finally looked at her. Not the CEO, not the man haunted by loss. Just Daniel. You didn't have to bring this to me, he said again, softer now. She felt something tighten in her chest. You shouldn't have to face this alone. He stepped toward her, slow, uncertain. Claire. Her breath caught. In the dimmed boardroom, with scattered documents still glowing under overhead lights, he looked at her as if seeing someone he hadn't known he needed. You saved my company, he said. You saved the truth. He hesitated. But what am I supposed to do? He whispered. With everything else you've brought back to life, the air between them stilled. Heat, fear, longing, all of it tangled in the silence. And Claire realized the real reckoning hadn't happened in the boardroom. It was happening right now. Daniel stood in the doorway without announcing himself, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the city behind him. Claire didn't hear him come in. She was sitting at her desk with her jacket still on, shoulders slumped, staring at the dim reflection of Chicago in the window. He watched her for a moment, quietly, as if afraid any sound might break whatever fragile peace she'd carved out for herself in the late hour. Claire, he said finally, and his voice steady but low pulled her back from wherever her mind had drifted. She turned, startled. Daniel? I didn't realize anyone else was still here. He stepped into the office, closing the door gently behind him. The click of it echoed in the quiet room. I wasn't going to stay, he said, but I needed to see you. She blinked, unsure how to answer. The night's chaos still clung to her. The boardroom, the fear in his eyes, the documents on the table, the man escorted out. Everything felt too large, too close. Daniel approached slowly, keeping a respectful distance. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled to his forearms, and he looked perhaps for the first time simply human. I owe you more than gratitude, he said, but I want to start there. She shook her head gently. You don't owe me anything. Yes, he replied, his words careful but firm. I do. He took another step toward her desk, stopping just before the edge, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, as if grounding himself. You didn't just uncover a threat to the company. You pulled me out of something I've been trapped in for years. Claire swallowed, feeling heat rise behind her ribs. She didn't know how to carry the weight of someone else's healing, not again. She had lived that story before, once, and it had taken pieces of her she hadn't gotten back. I'm glad I could help, she said softly, hoping the simplicity would keep things safe. But Daniel shook his head, the movement slow, almost reluctant. It was more than help. His gaze lowered for a moment, then lifted to meet hers. I haven't felt anything real since the night I lost my family. Not anger, not joy, not fear, just survival. Days passing because they had to. She held her breath. He spoke with the kind of honesty that belonged to late nights and tired hearts when the world was quiet enough for truths to rise. And then, you walked into my life, he said. Into my office. Into that sanctuary downstairs. And suddenly, I wasn't numb anymore. Her pulse steadied, then stumbled. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. He exhaled, slow, as if letting go of something old. You didn't try to fix me. You didn't pry. You just saw me. And after years of being a ghost in my own skin, that mattered more than you know. Claire felt a knot form behind her sternum. She had seen what happened when someone hoped too quickly. When they expected healing from another person instead of themselves. She couldn't be that again, not when her own life was barely holding together at the seams. Daniel, she said quietly, I don't want to be someone who rescues another broken man. I've done that before, and I lost myself in it. He looked stricken for a moment, but not offended more, like he understood the fear behind her words. I'm not asking you to save me, he said gently. I don't want that. He paused, searching for the right words. I want to share a meal with someone who knows what loss feels like. Someone who doesn't pretend. She stared at him, her chest tightening. She could feel how sincere he was, how careful he was being with her space, her fears, her boundaries, and that only made it harder. Daniel's eyes softened. Have dinner with me, Claire, not as my employee, not as a favor, just as two people who've both had to rebuild pieces of themselves. Silence filled the room, warm and heavy. Out the window, the skyline shimmered against the dark, thousands of windows glowing like distant stars. Their reflection fell across Daniel's face, catching the tired hope in his eyes. It was the most open she had ever seen him. No armor, no careful restraint. Just a man who had finally said something he'd been carrying alone for too long. Claire's fingers curled slightly against the edge of her desk. A part of her longed to say yes, longed for connection that wasn't born of duty or exhaustion, longed for someone who understood the quiet ache of living through things that changed the shape of a life. But her mother's health, the bills piling up, the fear of letting anyone close again. Her throat tightened. Daniel, I don't know if I can. The words trembled before she could steady them. He nodded, slow and patient, as if he'd expected that answer. You don't have to decide tonight, he said. I just needed you to know the invitation is real. She looked down at her hands, then at him again. I don't want to hurt you, Claire, he said softly. Life has already done that. You won't? Something in her chest loosened at his tone. Something else clenched. He stepped back, giving her space again. Think about it, he murmured. That's all I'm asking. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. For a moment, he didn't turn around. Then he did slowly, just enough for her to see the reflection of the city lights in his eyes. I meant every word tonight, he said, even the ones I didn't know how to say. The door closed softly behind him. Claire sat frozen long after his footsteps faded. The skyline glowed against the window, steady, patient, unchanging, while her heart beat in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Somewhere deep inside, she wondered, was she afraid to say yes, or afraid of everything that would happen if she did? Claire hadn't planned to stop by the office that Sunday afternoon. She had meant only to drop off a folder and leave before the empty halls made her feel lonelier than she already did. But the moment she stepped out of the elevator, she felt something shift in the air, the kind of stillness that made her breath catch. Daniel was standing at her desk, not pacing, not working, just standing there, hands in his pockets, as if he'd been waiting long enough to consider turning around. He lifted his head the second he heard her footsteps. Claire. She froze, coat still half on her arm. I didn't expect anyone here. I know, he said softly. That's why I came. She couldn't look at him right away. It felt too intimate, too raw, like being seen before she was ready. She slipped off her coat and draped it over her chair, buying herself an extra second. The Sunday light poured through the tall windows golden, quiet, undemanding. It softened the edges of everything, even the distance between them. Daniel took a slow breath. "I've been thinking about what I said, and what I asked of you." She nodded but said nothing. Her heart beat an uneven rhythm, as if caught between stepping forward and stepping back. He approached one cautious step at a time, leaving space for her to retreat if she needed it. "I don't want you to feel cornered," he said, "and I don't want you to feel responsible for me. That isn't love. That isn't what I feel." Her eyes lifted to meet his. His voice was warm, steady, but she could hear the tremor underneath, like a man speaking through a door he wasn't sure would open. "I should tell you something clearly," he continued. "I'm in love with you, Claire." The words landed gently, almost helplessly. Not a declaration, not a demand, just truth, offered like something fragile resting in his palms. Claire felt her breath hitch. No one had said those words to her without expectation or pressure in a very long time. No one had said them with such care. She pulled in a slow breath, steadying herself. "Daniel, that's a lot. I know." His voice cracked the smallest bit. "But it's real." She took a small step closer, enough for him to see that she hadn't run. "You've been through more than anyone should, and I'm still trying to hold myself together. I'm scared of losing who I am again." "I would never ask you to lose anything," he said, "least of all yourself." The sincerity in his tone disarmed her. She braced one hand against her desk, grounding herself as memories flickered through her. Her marriage ending quietly, painfully, the years of giving until she felt hollow, the fear that letting someone close might mean disappearing into their needs again. Daniel read the hesitation in her eyes, not by guessing, but by paying attention. He stepped closer and reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away. When she didn't, his hand rested lightly over hers on the desk. Warm, gentle. "Nothing more. You don't have to heal me," he said. "You don't have to fix anything. I don't want that. I just—" His breath shuddered. "I want the chance to know you, and I want to let you know me." She felt her shoulders soften. Her hand stayed beneath his. "I care about you," she whispered, the words trembling with honesty she could no longer hold back. "More than I meant to." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if steadying himself against the weight of hearing what he'd been afraid to hope for. When he looked at her again, his voice was barely above a breath. "Then, let's move slowly. As slow as you need. I don't want to rush anything. I just want a chance." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. There was something so human in the way he waited, quiet, patient, like a man who had learned the cost of breaking things that couldn't be repaired. Slowly, she lifted her free hand and touched his chest right over the place where his heart beat strong and steady beneath the fabric of his shirt. "Daniel, I think I want that too." His breath left him in a shaky exhale. He didn't reach for her. He waited, always giving her room to choose. She stepped forward, closing the last inches between them. Her head tilted up to him. His eyes softened in a way she hadn't seen before. Hopeful, vulnerable, scared in the most human way. "Come here," she whispered, almost inaudibly. He moved then very gently, very slowly. His hands rose to her arms first, just barely touching, asking permission without a word. When she leaned into him, his arms wrapped around her, drawing her into a quiet, steady embrace. It wasn't passionate. It wasn't rushed. It was the kind of embrace two people gave only when they understood how fragile trust could be. Claire closed her eyes against his shoulder. Daniel rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in a shared rhythm that felt like something beginning instead of ending. "I'm scared," she murmured. "I am too," he admitted. For a long moment, neither moved. The world outside the windows kept turning, cars passing, lights blinking on across the city, but inside that office, everything held still. When they finally eased apart, their foreheads remained touching, both eyes closed, as if opening them might break something delicate forming between them. Claire drew back just enough to meet his gaze. "We move slowly," she said. "Promise me that." Daniel nodded once. "At your pace, always." She gave a trembling, hopeful smile, then, "Yes." A careful yes. He exhaled, almost in relief, almost in awe, but as she rested her hands against his chest again, a quiet thought crept into her mind, a question that wouldn't quite settle. Could two people with shattered pasts really build something whole weeks later? The first thing Claire noticed when she stepped into Daniel's office wasn't the stack of reports on his desk or the emails glowing on his monitor. It was the photograph. For as long as she had worked there, the frame on the top shelf of his bookcase had lain face down, collecting a thin layer of dust like a quiet refusal. That afternoon, it stood upright, carefully placed, glass wiped clean, the picture inside catching the soft wash of early sunlight. His wife, his son, frozen in a moment before the world fell apart. Claire stopped in the doorway without meaning to. Something in her chest tightened and eased at the same time. Daniel, seated at his desk, followed her gaze. "I finally got tired of pretending it wasn't there," he said quietly. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The office felt different now. Not lighter, exactly, but more honest, as if a window that had been painted shut for years had finally been opened. "When did you turn it up?" she asked. "This morning," he replied. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. It felt overdue. She walked closer, her tote bag still hanging from her shoulder, the strap digging gently into her collarbone, a small reminder of the day she had just come from. She'd left the assisted living facility only an hour earlier. Her mother had been having a good day, humming to herself while they went through an old photo album, occasionally calling Claire by the right name instead of drifting into the past. Some days were better than others. Today had been kind, for that alone. Claire felt grateful. Daniel stood and moved beside her, leaving enough space that she didn't feel crowded. They looked at the photograph together in silence. His wife's hair glowed blonde in the sun, his son's grin wide and unrestrained. The three of them looked so untouched by what would come that Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. "They look happy," she said softly. "They were," Daniel answered. "We all were." He didn't flinch when he said it. There was sadness in his voice, but not the sharp, tearing kind she'd heard on the balcony months ago. This sounded more like a tenderness that had found a place to rest. Claire swallowed. "How do you feel? Seeing it there again?" He thought for a moment, then exhaled. "Like I'm letting them back into the room," he said, "without letting go of what I have now." She turned her head slightly, studying his profile the way the light touched the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the calm in his posture that hadn't existed when she first walked into his life by mistake. "If it ever feels like too much," she said, "you can. I don't want to hide them anymore." He looked at her then, his expression open, unguarded. "They're part of me. So are you." Heat bloomed softly in her chest at the simplicity of it. The past weeks had been a balancing act. Mornings at the office, evenings at the facility, weekends spent sorting through paperwork and medications, and a life that kept asking more of her than she felt she had. Somewhere in between, she and Daniel had begun to build something small and steady dinners that sometimes turned into long, quiet conversations, walks around the block after particularly hard days, the occasional brush of his hand against hers that no longer sent her spiraling into panic. They moved slowly, just as she'd asked, slowly, but not aimlessly. "How's your mom?" he asked now, as if reading the fatigue in her shoulders. "She had a good morning," Claire said. "Recognized me right away. Thought I was my younger self for a bit. But she knew I was hers. That was enough." His eyes warmed. "You've been doing so much. Claire, for her, for the company, for us." The last word came quietly, like something precious. "I'm doing what I can," she said. "Some days it feels like enough, some days it doesn't." He nodded with an understanding that went beyond words. For a while, they just stood there, side by side, the frame photograph anchoring the space between them. On Daniel's desk, another frame caught her eye, a smaller one she recognized. It held a picture taken at a company charity event just a week earlier, Daniel in a dark suit, Claire beside him in a simple navy dress, both of them caught in the middle of a laugh. The photographer had snapped it unexpectedly, and when Daniel showed it to her, she'd been startled by how at ease she looked. Now, the two frames spoke to each other across the room, the life he had before, and the life he was learning to live now. "Can I?" she asked, gesturing to the newer photo. He nodded. She lifted it gently, walking it over to the bookshelf. Her fingers hovered for a second before she set the frame down beside the first one, aligning the edges so they stood together in the same patch of afternoon light. Two worlds, side by side. Daniel watched her, something deep and quiet moving across his face. When she stepped back, he joined her, looking at both photos. For a long moment, neither spoke. Claire found herself holding her breath, waiting for any sign that this arrangement might hurt him, that the sight of his past and present sharing a shelf might be too much. But he just stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands hanging loosely at his sides. Then, slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a broad, triumphant smile. It was small, almost hesitant, but it reached his eyes. He looked at his wife and son with a softness that didn't crumble him. Then he looked at the newer photo with her, and the tenderness deepened, not divided. Claire felt something in her unclench. She realized, standing there in the glow of that afternoon, that acceptance didn't mean choosing one life over another. It meant holding both without letting either one cage you. He turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see herself reflected in his gaze. "I think," he said quietly, "they would have liked you." Her throat tightened. "I hope so." He reached for her hand then, not urgently, not possessively, just a simple, open invitation. She slid her fingers into his, feeling the familiarity of his touch, the way his palm fit against hers like something that had taken time to learn. They stood that way for a while, watching the light shift, the shadows on the frames slowly lengthening as the day moved on. Claire thought of all the doors she'd been afraid to open in her life, the ones she'd been certain would only lead to more hurt, more disappointment, more proof that she wasn't enough. She thought of the wrong floor, the wrong hallway, the wrong door she'd pushed open on her first day, and how it had led, somehow, to this moment, to a man who had lost everything and still found room to love again, to a woman who thought her life had already narrowed for good and then discovered it could still expand in quiet, surprising ways. Her fingers tightened around his just slightly. She wondered, as they stood there in the soft, shared stillness, how many other people were out there living behind closed doors, afraid to touch the handle, afraid to see what might be waiting on the other side, afraid, perhaps, of finding exactly what they needed. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, quietly, in the soft spaces between two ordinary moments. Life has a way of closing doors so firmly that we start to believe they were never meant to open again. Grief, disappointment, responsibility. They can build walls around us before we even notice. But every now and then, someone steps into our world gently, unexpectedly, and reminds us that we are still capable of feeling something real. Not to fix us, not to save us, but simply to sit beside the parts of our story we've tried to face alone. And maybe that's the quiet truth we forget as we grow older. Healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it's found in a steady presence, a kind word, a moment of being seen when you were sure no one was looking. It's the courage to let the past be part of you, without letting it define every corner of your life. If you're carrying something heavy tonight, I hope you remember this. It's never too late for a gentle beginning. And you don't have to open every door at once, just one small handle is enough. Thank you for spending your time with this story. Your presence truly matters. In a world that moves so quickly, The fact that you chose to sit with these moments means more than you know. If you feel this story carried a little kindness or comfort, a like, share, or subscribe helps that gentleness reach someone who might need it tonight. Wishing you a quiet, peaceful evening and a heart that feels just a little lighter.